Morning.
Morning.
How's it? Saribonani, Molueni, Khimora. Start with some South African. Hello. That's just to give you a little South African flavor. I mean, everybody's bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. I'm sure everybody went to bed at 9:30, 10 last night to prepare for a long, fun day talking about Africa. So I know, well, I didn't, but anyhow. So let me tell you about myself, and I'm going to launch into what's going to be a fairly rapid lecture. We don't have a lot of time, but I want to give you all a good overview of the continent, and especially when we're talking about South Africa, to understand better where this country fits into a continent, a very diverse continent of 54 or 49 countries, depending if you count Sub-Saharan or North Africa, and to try to just give you a lot of facts and figures about it. Me, first of all, I'm a little different. I actually am an analyst at the State Department. I work on African affairs. I've been there since 2000. Done 2 tours overseas, both of which have been in South Africa. 2004 to 2006 in Pretoria, and 2008 to 2011 in Cape Town. Has anybody here been to Cape Town? Any? So you can understand why my colleagues are very jealous of me, because it's a nice place to spend 3 years. While I was there, I actually did my doctoral work on South African foreign policy, and currently I actually teach at George Washington and Georgetown down in DC, classes on African security and African politics. So the lecture this morning is actually a distillation of a 14-week class I teach at GW about Africa, and specifically rising Africa in the world. And let's start with the first slide. I don't know, how much folks here have paid attention to the continent, how much you're reading the news about it, but if you've paid attention over the last couple of years, you see, I think these are both from 2011 in that range. The editors didn't do a good job coordinating because they were within weeks of each other. This idea that Africa is on the move. Africa is ascendant in the world. What that means, we'll talk about a little bit more specifically. Excuse me. And so this is kind of the dominant paradigm that we take into account right now. I mean, in the last 4 or 5 years, this has become the way that the West in particular looks at the continent. Now, I throw these out, and then let's go back a little bit to see relatively the same magazine cover. You can tell by the font it's very 90s. I think this is from about 97, 98. You can see the Clinton headline at the top. So when I was studying Africa, I went to George Washington and got into it in the late 90s. And it was interesting because a lot of the same discussions that we're seeing now were on the table then. Africa in the late 90s, you saw a new generation of leaders. You saw a wave of democratization, better moving away from statist economic policies, and a general perspective that things were also on the move. Now, so that's 98. We're talking about 2011 in the previous slide. And in between, this is, I think, from about 2003, another Economist cover. And so this is looking at the various cycles of war, conflict that we've seen throughout the continent. Now, to go between all of these and this, I mean, it's a bit of a pendulum. And what you'll see in studies of African affairs is this constant back and forth between the so-called Afro-optimists, the Africa rising, Africa's on the move, and the Afro-pessimists, which is getting at the hopeless continent here, that this is a place scarred by war, scarred by conflict, underdevelopment. What's the answer? I mean, if there's one takeaway that I want you to come out of today, there is no right answer. I mean, this pendulum, there's a lot of discussion in between the two extremes. And there's a lot of study that needs to be done. I mean, one thing, if any of you are budding Africanists, I always say to my students, if you're looking at especially serious doctoral work, topics, if you want to touch on things that have never been touched on before, you have got a wealth of possibilities looking at the continent. It is remarkably understudied and misunderstood. And so just a few things about why we're talking about this Africa rising hypothesis. So it's the next big thing. I mean, if you watch the evening news, I mean, you'll see, I always call it my dad test. If my dad calls me up and says, wow, Africa's been in the news a lot lately. He follows international affairs a little bit, but it's this sort of thing that it comes into the public consciousness a little bit more. So why are we talking about economic growth? We'll talk about this a little bit more in a few minutes. But one reason why we're seeing so much discussion of Africa being on the move is because you're seeing economic growth rates that are quite robust, at least in certain places. Why? Getting back to exports, and this is just a very brief overview, but what the continent is producing, especially in terms of primary resources, is very much in demand right now, especially because of China. And if folks, this is another common theme that you hear coming up time and time again. It's the role of China in Africa, which I think is a bit overstated. I think it's a dead horse is being beaten at this point, because there's a lot of other fascinating issues to talk about in terms of external involvement on the continent. But Chinese demand and really global demand for African commodities is driving a lot of this growth. Another thing, in terms of looking beyond the economic issues, you are seeing some positive developments on the continent. Going back to the Hopeless Continent magazine cover, you saw this picture of war and conflict, and something that still is rife on the continent. However, you have seen some positive things. I work a lot on Somalia, and over the last couple of years, you've seen Somalia, which has been an utter and complete basket case for 20 years. A failed state, if you want to call it that. I mean, it really kind of fits the definition quite well. But you've actually seen a modicum of stability returning to Somalia. So that alone has been a very positive development. Other places on the continent, you've seen a diminution of conflict. The African Union, which we'll talk about a little bit, is an organization of African states that is, since it was founded about 10 years ago, has actually taken conflict resolution, conflict management to given it a lot more importance. And so because of that, you're seeing more peaceful transitions of power, generally less acceptance of coups, although we're still seeing coup d'etat on the continent. And then lastly, kind of getting back to the economic issue, you're seeing an improvement in infrastructure, all of the things that are drivers of growth. Chinese investment has been a big part of this. But in general, all of these are combining for a picture that's a little bit more optimistic from the outside view. Sorry, there we go. Now, it's not all rainbows and roses. Let's just talk about that up front too. Security situation on the continent is probably better than in recent years. However, there's still a lot out there. I'm sure folks have heard about the situation in Mali, a very complex situation that we'll talk a bit more about. Congo has been a mess for 2 decades and doesn't show any signs of getting better. Boko Haram, this rather mysterious terrorist group in the north of Nigeria, has become increasingly active in recent years. And speaking from a government perspective, I mean, these are things that are keeping people up at night in Washington, especially when we're seeing this overlay of Islamic extremism and threats against Western tourists, Western facilities, what we saw in Algeria recently. These are things that are very, very worrying to Western capitals. And solving these conflicts, when I say no answers in sight, these are very, very complex situations. I mean, this is why I said I've been given an impossible job this morning, because when you look at sub-Saharan Africa, when you look at 49 countries, you're looking at 49 different sets of politics, actually even more than that. Regional differences, ethnic differences. So the reasons why there's conflict in Eastern Congo have nothing to do with why there's conflict in, say, between North Sudan and South Sudan, or in Nigeria, or in, Southern Africa is relatively calm. But the point is there's no toolkit you can apply universally. So I'll give you a few overview points, but in general, each and every one of these conflicts deserves study on its own. Another thing, whereas the Afro-optimists, the Africa Rising crowd, point to democratic reforms, there's more elections, which is very true. I mean, since the end of the Cold War, most every country on the continent does have elections. Some of them are very well run. In a place like Ghana, you'll see these elections where it's 52 to 48 or 51 to 49. Very competitive, very open, very free and fair. But then you'll see in Equatorial Guinea where the president wins with 96% of the vote. So there's still a few problems around here. Corruption, Professor Picard spoke to that a bit yesterday in terms of South Africa. South Africa is head and shoulders above the rest of the continent. This is still a massive problem. Economic diversification is one of the most important issues and one that I think deserves a lot more study. When we talk about Africa's economic growth, I mentioned this earlier, you're seeing a lot of focus on export of primary raw materials. Is there value added in the system? Are you seeing situations where, for example, manufacturing, other exports, other ways of building the economy are being explored? Generally, I'd say no. And this is something that deserves a lot more study and attention. And lastly, another understudied issue, but education and health, I think, deserve people are not looking at this nearly enough. Where you see educated populations and where you see populations that their governments take care of them from a health standpoint, that's where you're going to see real, lasting change on the continent. You see this some places. I would posit, however, that you're not seeing this being taken on by African governments nearly enough. So just, we have less than 60 minutes, but this is a few things I want to go over. I'll basically break out everything I just talked about into a little bit more detail. And then lastly, go into where South Africa fits here. South Africa is a very odd piece of the puzzle. Let's lay that out right away. It has a foot in Africa, it has a foot in Europe, a foot in the developing world, a foot in the developed world. It's one of them. This is what's drawn me to South Africa and kept me so fascinated by it through the years. Because there is no, every country is unique, obviously. But I think South Africa takes its uniqueness to a new level. There's just no country out there that really fits in the same way. So, okay, I hope everybody knows what this is. You can see the world's newest country right here in South Sudan. Colonial borders that were laid out more or less in 1885 that have become the map of Africa today, for better or for worse. Because this map, as we'll talk about shortly, in terms of conflict, has driven a lot of the conflict that we've seen since independence. Several of these countries, Nigeria is a country with, I think, 500 different languages. It's remarkably diverse, remarkably diverse. And you have certain places, especially like Nigeria, where certain peoples have been grouped together on the colonial map that in many ways wouldn't necessarily make a good fit for a country. And this is what we've seen actually between Sudan and South Sudan. After a 50-year civil war, South Sudan finally gained its independence. A few fun facts and figures, very interesting facts and figures. One thing, I go back to North Africa. The linkages between North Africa and the southern part of the continent, sub-Saharan Africa, are relatively limited. Although, as we've seen with the flow of arms and mercenaries from Libya into Mali, touching off that conflict, the links can't totally be ignored. Approximately 1 billion people, highest growth rate in the world. Birth rates remain extremely high, and mortality, even though it's still high, is falling. So you're getting into a situation where you've got a youth bulge, and I saw this the other day, and it's one of those figures you hear in the back of your head, but it's kind of hard to wrap your mind around that in 37 years, half the world's population is estimated to be African. Combined with lower or higher mortality in Asia, the one-child policy in China, and you can see actually how this could come to be. And so this is why I think more and more, the continent deserves a lot of attention. This is not, Africa has long been relatively peripheral to the United States, to less so to Europe. But it's not a place that's ever been of necessarily key strategic concern. But when essentially half the population of the world is coming from there, and becoming a growing source of raw materials, it's becoming very strategically important. So let's talk about the economy. So this is getting into the Africa Rising hypotheses. McKinsey did a recent study on this that referred to the Africa cheetah economies and the lion economies. Very kind of hokey, but getting at the point that these are really rapidly growing economies. So 4.9%, 5.7% in 2013. If you compare them to global rates, 3.5, 4.1 in 2014, it's significantly outperforming the global economy. And if you think about the U.S. economy, what would President Obama give for even 3% growth? So you see that it's moving quite quickly. And if you take South Africa out of the mix, all of these numbers would be over 6%. And we'll get to that a little bit later, but that shows that, especially if South Africa is growing at a much slower pace than the rest of the continent for various reasons. And so if you take it out of the mix, the continent's really booming. Now, it's not universal. Not every country is moving on, but a third of countries are going to grow at more than 6%. Some of the figures are, well, I have it a little bit later, but I think South Sudan is slated to grow at about 69% this year, which is, you can't even wrap your mind around that. Of course, it declined by 55% last year. I mean, when you're thinking about African numbers, it's a little bit tricky to put them all into context. Primary commodities are booming, but also, it's not just oil and platinum and natural gas. Telecommunications, the boom of cell phones on the continent is astounding. Financial services, retail. Retail is a fascinating one. I mean, I don't know if anybody's followed this, but Walmart just bought Massmart, which is a huge South African retailer, and basically to get Walmart into the African market. Because Walmart looks at an economy that's growing at 6% a year and says, okay, this is a poor country, but in a few years, then they'll be able to afford, luxury shampoo, throw it out there. And then in a few more years, when incomes are rising, then they can afford a microwave. And then a few more years along the line, a washing machine or a television. So, I mean, when you see these rates of growth, even, this is not talking about buying having incomes anywhere on par with those of the West, but there's a lot of opportunities for Western retailers and manufacturers to peddle their wares on the continent. So a lot of interest is going on right here. Now, let's walk it back. I don't want to go back to the hopeless continent picture, but when talking about the continent, and this is something that it's a little bit of a pet peeve of mine when you hear the Afro-optimists talk about how things are booming, and they are. I mean, I will grant it that the rates of economic growth you can't really argue with. I mean, it's relatively straightforward, but there's a lot of question marks along the way, and a lot of things that I think everybody should take note of. So, no matter what you say, things are booming, but this is the poorest region of the world by far. This actually shocked me. I didn't realize it was the case, but bottom 25 countries on the UN Human Development Index are all African countries. Places, especially in the Sahel, I think usually Niger is considered the poorest country of the world, and I haven't been, but I've got colleagues who have served there, and the poverty, the utter and complete grinding poverty is almost impossible for us to understand. And so, when you're looking around the continent, even if you're growing, a place like Niger can grow at 6% a year for 100 years and still barely make it into kind of the middle income sort of band. Not very well integrated too, and increasingly with the exports of oil and gas in particular, it's becoming more integrated, but in general, for example, if you look at the linkages between global growth or the differences between global growth and African growth, you see that South Africa is the only place that generally mirrors the global economy, because South Africa is the only country that does have trade linkages with the global north, with Europe, the United States. Otherwise, the continent is relatively marginal to the rest of the world. So if you look, just getting at putting things into perspective, the total GDP, $1.3 trillion. So what, 1 billion people, so 15 to 20% of the global population, generating 2% of the global economy. And yeah, if Africa was a country, it would rank between Spain and Mexico. So just to put this all in perspective, even though this is a place that's booming and growing, it's still got a long way to go. And this is the other thing I tell all of my students, and please take this to heart. If you ever see a number come out of Africa, don't trust it. South Africa is the only exception. They actually have Stats SA, which is actually their official government statistical agency, which is quite good. But in general, any number on the continent should be suspect. And this Ghana note, recently the World Bank looked at Ghana's economy and said, congratulations, you just grown 40%. So I think it's $5 billion, and they said, no, your economy is actually $7 billion. which, I mean, think about that. That's a massive statistical error. But it goes to show, and Ghana is a relatively well-studied economy too. But when you're looking at other places, your Nigers, your Malis, the numbers are just very, very difficult to kind of understand. And so, just a word of caution, always be a little bit leery of African statistics. This is a older slide, and it's still relatively true. The degree to which countries depend on aid. So, Congo being the giant sucking sound in the middle of the continent. I mean, it's massively, more than 75% dependent. Ethiopia, even places like Uganda. Uganda is considered one of the better performing countries on the continent, but I can't remember what the figure is. Maybe 15 to 20% of their budget, is directly given to them by Western donors. And so even where you see these countries that seem like good performers, you've also got to keep in mind that they're being propped up to a great degree by Western assistance. So about $44 billion a year in official development assistance. You're going to hear more about HIV and AIDS this afternoon. We'll talk about it a little bit. But one of the programs of the Bush administration that is still going strong and has been a massive boon to the continent is the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. In 2013, we'll spend about $7–8 billion on the continent for HIV and AIDS relief. Oh, please.
I was wondering, who provides this aid to Africa?
We do. Well, PEPFAR is a solely U.S. project. Britain, France, Netherlands, really, most of it is European. Japan is also a big player. China is providing a bit of it, although Chinese aid, we give aid in a classic sense of, there are critiques of the aid industry. Chinese aid is much more tied, however, to what Chinese businesses, for example, are going to get out of it. So there's two different ways of looking at aid is basically the short way of putting it. But the classic, model of providing aid for education, health, and so on, really most of that is coming from the U.S. and Europe. So, yeah, please.
Just one more question.
Sure.
What makes them grow at 5.5 compared to the world 4.1? In general, how really they're having this growth?
Oh, well, I'll get to that in a second. The short answer is primary exports. But it's a little bit more debatable about that. Yeah, please. For
it shouldn't be bad that we're giving them money, but do you think that it's a bad thing that they're being helped out so much so that in the future, when they say they don't receive aid, it's like...
So basically, should we let them stand on their own 2 feet? That's certainly one of the debates out there. I don't want to pass too many judgments on what's the right or wrong way to go, but yeah, that's certainly one of the arguments that you hear of kind of the development industry, if you want to call it that. Sure. Oh, it's something that you see quite a bit. I agree with you 100%. I think a lot of folks are. That's a great word for it. We do homogenize the way that we look at the continent. And there are a lot of Africa experts out there that do try to homogenize this. There's not one set of policy solutions from a U.S. government standpoint. We don't look at South Africa in terms of what the way we engage with South Africa, the way we do in Sudan or Nigeria. There's different sets of issues. But you are seeing a kind of a homogenization of this. And this is what I want to kind of disaggregate for all of you right now, is just to keep that in mind. One last question. I want to, because we're a little bit limited on time, but.
Is there a general reason why as a continent it's so backward and undeveloped? No other continent suffers as such a massive, all the countries suffer. There's got to be something else driving that.
Well, that's another great question that we could talk for hours about. But the one statistic I throw out, in 1960, more or less, essentially the dawn of independence, Ghana had a higher GDP than South Korea. If you looked at countries like Cote d'Ivoire, not every country on the continent at independence was looked at as a potential rising star, but you did see pockets of hope. There was a feeling in European capitals, especially those granting independence, that these countries would be able to more or less stand on their own 2 feet. And we've seen over the last 50 years that has not been the case, except more for isolated situations. Now, I mean, one thing I'd come back to, and I'll mention this a little bit later, is the issue of human capacity. Congo, Zaire, Democratic Republic of Congo, had, I think, 13 university graduates at independence in a country of how many million people. I mean, so these countries were really, really starting on the back foot in terms of capacity, infrastructure as well. So, and then, you know, there's also critiques of former colonial powers, especially Francophrique, the idea that France wanted to keep its former colonies more or less enthralled to them. Certainly, you know, some strong arguments in that. So basically, there's a lot of different reasons, but I always go back to education. I mean, I think that's one that we can't really emphasize enough. So I'm going to roll through these, and we'll have some time for questions at the end, and I'm going to be around all day. I'm doing another lecture this evening, and so grab me throughout the day, too, if anything you want to talk about. So yeah, it's about, I mean, of all the aid on the planet, 35–40% is going to the continent. And you know, over the last 50 years, this has been the case. And it's in general proven relatively ineffective. I mean, you just do not see, you know, the whole idea behind, a theoretical idea behind foreign aid is, it's the classic teach a man to fish parable. The idea is, okay, we're going to provide aid for a certain project for a certain amount of time, and then the country, the industry is going to be able to stand on its own 2 feet. And we've just very rarely seen that on the continent. So a few other things. I won't talk about too much about HIV, but you know, to think about the continent in terms of the challenges that it's facing, it's definitely the region of the world most touched by it. We are just now starting to see some positive changes in terms of infection rates, people living with HIV. We've seen significant declines in mortality through PEPFAR. You know, it's amazing. You know, 5.6 million people just in South Africa. No country in the world has a similar, anywhere near that number of people with HIV. You know, and some of the prevalence rates between 15 and 49-year-olds are still shocking. Now, all of these countries are PEPFAR recipients. Nearly all, I mean, you'll hear more. My understanding, nearly all South Africans with HIV have access to antiretrovirals. People aren't dying of AIDS. HIV is becoming a manageable syndrome, something that you can live with. Are we seeing behavior changes in terms of spreading the disease? That's another question. I'd argue that we're not seeing the behavioral changes, especially in terms of sexual behavior, that are turning this around, although you'll hear a more expert presentation this afternoon on that. Anybody had malaria ever? Sucks, doesn't it? Yeah. When I was a starving undergrad, I actually did a malaria vaccine test at Walter Reed Hospital in DC, and short answer is it didn't work. And so they caught it right away and pumped me full of drugs. But for 3 days or so, I had what felt like the worst flu ever. I mean, malaria is a remarkably debilitating disease. Certain forms of it will stay in your liver, come back throughout your life. But yeah, nearly 200 million cases of malaria on the continent every year. Half a million deaths. You can do this is where actually a lot of aid projects have gone in the last few years. Relatively effective ones in terms of giving out bed nets, which are much cheaper than trying to develop a vaccine. South Africa is about the only country that isn't subject to, it's not really in a malarial zone. But this is another, people talk about HIV a lot. I just want to get out there, and then also TB, malnutrition, famine, which certainly comes up time and again in various countries, waterborne diseases. People hear about Ebola and some of the more exotic ones. But the point is, there's a lot of things on this continent that kill people, and dealing with them is an extreme challenge for these governments. So we'll talk about security. This is the other, now getting back to the hopeless continent picture. When you think of Africa, when your average layman in the United States thinks of Africa, I'd contend they think of warfare. They think of child soldiers. They think of blood diamonds. They think of all of these sexy topics that have been hit on by the press. And in many ways for good reason. I mean, I think they're relatively poorly understood, but it's the region of the world really most plagued by conflict. Interstate conflict, intrastate, for various complex reasons. mean, I think very broadly, competition for scarce resources. You can apply this to almost every conflict on the continent and find some linkage to issues over resources. Ethnic and regional rivalries, linguistic rivalries, especially going back to this issue of colonial boundary making, poor leadership. This has been talk about this a little bit more shortly, but this has been a region of the world really touched by some of the worst leadership and governance anywhere in the world. And increasingly religious extremism, which is something I think I mentioned, is worrying for Western governments, Al-Shabaab in Somalia, Boko Haram in Nigeria, AQIM, other movements. Now, when you look at all these movements, you can also apply ethnic and regional rivalries, competition for resources. Criminality is one I would add to this mix as well. If we won't talk too much about Mali, but if you look at what's going on in northern Mali, which has made a lot of headlines, a lot of the analysis of it is fairly weak, I think. There's a lot of very, very complex reasons for what's going on in northern Mali. And it's not just, oh, there's Islamic extremists out there. That's just a much more of an oversimplification than is the case. Few of the current conflicts, I mean, just things that are going on at the moment. You're seeing this across the Sahel. Where this goes is anybody's guess. It's certainly been taking up a lot of bandwidth over the last year or so. Boko Haram, we've mentioned. Eastern Congo, another, I could devote 14 weeks to talking about what's going on in Eastern Congo and still not get to the bottom of it. A very complex situation mixed into, with Rwandan ambitions, Ugandan ambitions. There's a lot of interstate rivalries at play in this region, in the Great Lakes more broadly. Somalia is better, but it's still not out of the woods yet. There's still conflict going on. Sudan and South Sudan, I mentioned the civil war relatively briefly, but even though South Sudan is now independent, there's still a lot of cross-border issues that remain to be resolved, especially over getting South Sudanese oil to market. And some, I'm sure folks have heard maybe about Joseph Kony and the LRA. The LRA is a very bizarre organization over the last 25 years. It's a pseudo-cult based around this guy Kony. And they've displaced hundreds of thousands of people, killed thousands in northern Uganda, Sudan, for reasons that still to this day aren't terribly apparent. But the point is, they're still, we actually have U.S. soldiers, U.S. military in Uganda helping the Uganda military find Joseph Kony right now. So it's one of those issues that's kind of receded into the background, but still remains current. And lastly, the crisis of governance. I mean, this is difficult to quantify. I mentioned this in terms of we see more elections nowadays, but the quality of these elections, the quality of democracy, the quality of public participation in the political sphere is still very much lacking across the continent. We saw a great deal of military coups, governments not of the people, by the people, for the people. These are governments by elites, by the big man theory is kind of what's commonly referred to as the African presidents just dominating the political sphere and giving all the spoils to their friends, clansmen, and so on. This is the end of the Cold War. Really throughout the Cold War, we put up with this. From 1960 to 1990, we were playing a game with the Soviets that we had our proxies, they had their proxies, and we really didn't care too much about how they governed themselves, as long as they were loyal. So we had guys like Mobutu Sese Seko in Zaire, Congo, who was one of the worst autocrats that we've seen anywhere in the world, but he was our buddy, and so we were happy to put up with it. Now, at the end of the Cold War, the Soviets disappeared. We said, oh, by the way, it's about time you reformed your political systems. And we saw, this is getting back to that first Africa Rising magazine cover from the 90s. I mean, this is when we saw, oh, they're having elections now. Oh, this is a new generation. There's going to be better governance. And I think we've been quite disappointed in general in terms of how these democratic systems have taken off. Some places like Ghana, I mentioned, Senegal has shown excellent progress, South Africa, but several countries have figured out how to, several leaders have figured out how to manage the political process for their own gains. And so the long story short is, as much as we've seen some progress in the last 20 years, governance on the continent tends to still be very, very weak. And a lot of democratic improvement is going to be necessary, I think, for, again, some of these, to talk about Africa rising in a sustainable fashion. This is something that needs to be addressed. So now, why, getting back to this question, why is Africa rising? Why are these economies taking off? I've mentioned some of this already. But we've seen, again, some improvement here, perception that the region is becoming less conflict-stricken, public health gains, especially against HIV. I've mentioned all of this before. But then the issue of economy is the most important. I mean, the more I read, the more I'm becoming interested in economic issues. I mean, just when you understand how much of Africa's economy is driving perceptions of the continent and really having an impact on the lives of its people. So it's the fastest growing region in the world. I mean, this is some actual historical, 6.5 a year between 04 and 08. And then, even in 2009, when we're in the midst of the Great Recession, it still grew at 2.8%. I mean, this is pretty shocking. So what I showed you earlier in terms of growth this year and the next couple of years, this is not a new phenomenon. I mean, we've been seeing this since about 2004. And so the trend lines are very, very clear. 11 of the 20 fastest growing economies in the world. I think, South Sudan, although that's a little misleading. So why is this growing? We cannot overstate hydrocarbons. There is massive demand for African oil and increasingly now African gas. We've got mature producers, Angola, Nigeria, two countries where the United States gets a great deal of oil. Equatorial Guinea, it's small, brutal little despot off the west coast of Africa, and around 2000 they discovered just massive quantities of oil offshore. And so you've seen, I mean, this is an economy that's would see growth at 20, 30, 40% per year. It's only a country of 700,000 people, but it's become a major oil exporter. Now Ghana, if anybody studied oil and economies, issues of Dutch disease, how oil crowds other things out of the market, oil is a blessing and a curse. I mean, that's the upside, the general perspective of oil on the continent. You've seen, especially places like Nigeria and Angola that should be shining stars on the continent, have actually regressed democratically, have not shown any efforts to diversify economically. There's some worries about Ghana. Ghana is, really a shining star on the continent. But there's a lot of questions. Okay, in about 3 years' time, Ghana is going to become a major oil exporter. What is that going to do to the rest of the economy? What is that going to do regarding corruption? Because let's just say negotiating oil contracts isn't something that's done very publicly. So Mozambique, I raise, country right next to South Africa, which has got a lot of South African interest. But they've just discovered how many trillions of cubic feet of gas off the coast of Mozambique. Anadarko, which is a U.S. company, is going, I can't remember the figure, it's $7, $8, $9 billion. They're going to invest more in Mozambique than the entire GDP of Mozambique. So when you put all of this into perspective, it's really kind of mind-blowing how much is there. Now, it's not just hydrocarbons. Mining, if anybody's looked at the price of gold, platinum, rare earths, everything, nickel, tin, you name it, copper, all of this is through the roof right now. In the 90s, you couldn't get rid of copper. Now, people are stealing copper wire out of telephone poles. So, agriculture too. You're seeing investments, especially by Gulf states, which is interesting. Qatar, the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, buying land in places like Mozambique. Hey, this is land that's not being farmed in a commercial fashion. Why don't we buy it, farm it, and turn it into commercial agriculture to feed states in the Gulf that are subject to, they don't really have any agricultural sector. So you're seeing everybody around the world is looking at the African continent and saying, gee, there's a lot of stuff here that we could be developing and using essentially for our own good. And China is the primary driver of this. And look, it's not the only country. If you want, anybody can Google China and Africa, and you'll see tons of articles about it. It's a fascinating story, but increasingly Brazil, India, your other BRICS. Russia, not so much. Turkey, which is the forgotten BRIC. Qatar, UAE, plenty of countries coming in. Not just the French, the British, the Americans, and I think we're actually well down the list at this point. But the point is, with Chinese growth over the last 2 decades, 7, 8% a year, they need to feed the beast. I mean, they need oil, they need gas, they need various minerals. And so this has been a driver of this African growth. And this is one of the debates that the Africa Rising crowd has. How much, to what degree is Chinese growth inextricably linked with African growth? And some will downplay it. They say, oh, there's enough diversification elsewhere. The bottom line is nobody knows. There's a series of articles in Foreign Affairs. One guy wrote, Africa's rising. Another guy wrote, no, it's not rising. And the third, the most convincing argument was, we don't know if Africa's rising because we don't know enough about the statistics and the real drivers of it. So I don't leave you with any takeaways on this except for the fact that it deserves a lot more study. And it's also not very well integrated into the global economy, which I mentioned before. So if the global economy is tanking, it's a good thing that you're not too tied up in it. Here are a few things that the Africa Rising crowd will point out. They'll say better economic policies. I mean, you've seen over the last 10 years something very prosaic, but African governments actually seeking credit ratings. So if you want to borrow money internationally, even if you have a B- or a B credit rating, it's better than not having a credit rating at all. And so you've seen some of these improvements. Governance and security, infrastructure development. You've seen a lot more infrastructure. Chinese are building roads, dams, buildings. They're not always standing after a few years, but that's another story. And this is the question right here. If China catches a cold, will Africa survive? I mean, we don't know. I mean, Chinese growth, I'm not an expert on China, but the days of massive, unfettered Chinese growth are probably going to come to an end or at least slow down. I mean, if China's growing even at 4%, which we would consider healthy, what is that going to mean for places like pick your Zambia, where China has invested a great deal of money? It's a good question. Nobody really knows right now. And lastly, sustainability. These are some of the things I look at in terms of where, if you're going to see a sustainable Africa in the long term, what are the questions? Diversification of economies, getting away from being primary exporters. Botswana is a fascinating case. If you know anything about Botswana, you know about diamonds. The Botswana government partnered with De Beers, really at independence, grew at 8 to 10% for a good 30 years, just selling diamonds. And De Beers, being a bit of a monopoly, was able to keep prices high, kind of worked out well for everybody, unless you're buying a diamond. But Botswana did something in recent years that was interesting, is they pressed De Beers and said, look, we're tired of you taking our diamonds and shipping them to India to be cut. We demand that you build a cutting facility in Botswana. And they didn't want to do it, but finally the government leaned on them enough that they caved. And so created a facility that, Botswana is a small country. So 200, 300 jobs cutting and polishing diamonds, which are decent middle-class jobs, relatively skilled jobs. And so this is the idea of diversification. It's getting away from, hey, here's our rocks, here's our tin. It's trying to find a way to add value to those products. And in general, African countries have a long way to go on this front. Education, health, infrastructure, always watch this, especially the education standpoint. Educational outcomes on this continent are ridiculously low still. Even in South Africa, which we'll talk more about this afternoon, South Africa has a lot of work to do on its education front. And then how much are they integrating regionally? I mean, it's ridiculous that, if you look at West Africa, there's no road really that goes along from Accra to Lagos. I mean, this is the most heavily, densely populated part of the continent. And yet, to go from Lagos to Accra, you have to cross 15 checkpoints. You have to go over pockmarked, potholed roads, to, linguistic barriers going through Francophone countries. The idea of regional integration is something that's talked about a lot, but it really is more talk than action right now. Lots of research needed. So, lastly, I want to wrap up fairly quickly to leave a little bit of time for questions, but where does South Africa fit in here? So, I'll say one thing, living in South Africa, you're always shocked, well, at least I was shocked at first, especially talking with white South Africans, but really South Africans just who have money, and so increasingly black and non-white middle class, and you'll talk and they'll say, oh, I've been to Africa, or I'm going on vacation in Africa. And it's shocking the first few times you hear it, like, wait, where are we again? But it's this conceptualization that South Africans understand that they're part of Africa, but in many ways don't view themselves as Africans. And this is not just a white South African thing. This is South Africans of all races are increasingly taking this view. And so South Africa is at the same time very much a part of the continent, but also very much apart from it. And it's a very complex role in terms of identity and also just economic relationships as well. So, I mean, anybody who's been knows that this is a very dichotomous place in terms of having shanty towns next to very well-developed cities like Johannesburg, Sandton. When you get off the airplane in Johannesburg, I mean, you could be in Dallas, you could be in Northern Virginia. I mean, it really is kind of shocking, jarring to the eye to realize that you're in a pretty developed place, especially around Gauteng province. And so, and when you look around the continent, as much as these other places are growing at 6% a year, there's nowhere that's really comparable to South Africa in terms of its economic development. This alone is the 29th largest GDP in the world, about a quarter still of Africa's GDP. This is coming down, as we'll talk about. Gauteng, which is Joburg, I mean, that's 10% of Africa's GDP is in one city, which you saw last night in Professor Picard's slide. Even Western Cape, where I lived in Cape Town, that would be the 5th largest, I think, just behind Angola, 5th largest economy on the continent. And it's also, it's a diverse economy too. I've talked about diversification. People think of South Africa's economy around, you think of mining. I mean, that's the first thing, diamonds, gold, platinum, what have you. But mining is only about 5% of the economy right now. So financial services, retail, I mean, it's services of different types, agriculture. There's a lot of drivers of the South African economy. There's been some critiques that a downturn in China will really devastate South Africa. But I think South Africa is going to be much more insulated from an Asian downturn than other places would be. So decline is a word I don't like to use. I was at a thing in DC, and some guy from a big US company started off talking about Africa as a conversation like this, and he said, well, as we know, South Africa is in economic decline. And there was a woman, one of the panelists, who was from the IMF, and she said, whoa, excuse me, sir, we don't consider an economy that's still growing at more than 3% in the worst global recession we've seen in years to be in decline by any means. And so when you hear that, and you will hear this come up from time to time, I think it's about putting South Africa into the proper context. So South Africa, when the ANC government took power in '94, we'll talk about this more this afternoon, but they laid out a plan saying, look, to get South Africans out of poverty, we need to grow about 6% a year. The South African economy structurally, I would say, can't grow at 6% a year. This is a developed economy. It's a mature economy. It doesn't have the easy wins that you would have. You don't have something just coming out of the ground that they can export for massive profits, to find a way to generate this economic growth. And so, but at the same time, 3.6%, 2012 to 2016, that's not so bad. I mean, that would be, again, President Obama would be thrilled to have that kind of economic growth. Here's one of the problems. It's not an oil producer. It's not a gas producer. Some potential, but not really. Coal is its biggest source of energy generation, which they have actually in large. Well, I will say they actually do export coal to China, although it's not terribly profitable. The mining sector, this is another problem with it. We'll talk more about the miners this afternoon, and Professor Picard alluded to it. This is a mining sector. Like any mine, you can't just keep digging forever. I mean, you are going to run out of whatever it is you're digging up. And especially with something like gold, when gold is 500 meters below the surface, okay, you got to dig and invest in it. But when it's getting to 2 kilometers, 3 kilometers below the surface, the investment that you have to make in these mines is significant. And so you need a price of gold that is going to be very much elevated. The economics of it have to work, basically. And increasingly in South Africa, the economics are not working, even with prices the way they are. And so this is the grand debate between miners who say, hey, we want more money, we want a living wage, and mine operators who are saying, we can't pay you that, or we're going to be losing money. And of course, the miners don't trust the management and so on and so forth. But the point stands up. I mean, this is a mining sector that is going to struggle to be competitive in the next few years. And then lastly, we'll hit on education all the time. Apartheid education left most South Africans non-white South Africans without the educational skills to compete in the global economic market. The government has invested a lot of money into addressing this, but the educational outcomes still are not there. And so this is going to be a problem over the next few years. And then, again, a lot of this we'll talk about more this afternoon, but the issues of inequality are still there. And so because of all this, South Africa, like I said, is 25% of the African GDP, but 20 years ago, it was probably 35%. And so the role of South Africa on the continent, even though it still remains dominant and still the biggest player, it's much less of a, if you look at it as a chart like this, the slice of the pie is increasingly shrinking. Now, since '94, South Africa has been a very active player on the continent. President Mbeki, who we'll talk about more, was very much a leading light, a real key driver of South Africa's foreign policy, and pushing for more integration, pushing South Africa to be a responsible player on the continent. As you well know, South Africa during the apartheid era was involved in regional destabilization exercises, invaded its neighbors. Professor put it, the polecat of the world. And so Mbeki, in particular, he was deputy president before this, but it was always the key driver of South African foreign policy, pushed to have the country be a very active, but also very welcome partner on the continent. And so he was constantly pushing this, but also pushing African governments to be better performers in terms of democracy and governance. He took the view, I think very rightly, look, if the continent can show that it is stable and can govern itself well and is democratic, then we're going to get more interest of Western investment. This is what's going to open the door, but as long as the continent's a basket case, we're not going to see it. And so, the African Union, which is followed on the old Organization of African Unity, was a much more active group on this front. It also sent a lot of money and spent a lot of money and put a lot of troops out there for African peacekeeping missions. And then the one other thing I'd note here, we talked about the BRICS on the continent. Don't think for a minute that South Africa is not a new player on the continent, or at least in terms of an active player. South African business is going gangbusters into the continent. Mining, retail, finance, telecoms. South African firms are dominating across the continent. And so this has become from a government standpoint, very much an interest of Pretoria. Now, it's not always been wine and roses. There's a lot of jealousy of South Africa. Let's get that out there. If you talk to a Nigerian about, South Africa is a G20 member. It's the only African G20 member. And that's the first thing you'll hear from a Nigerian. Oh, they're not African. We should be the ones there. We're the faster growing economy. Nigeria is actually going to soon, in the next 5 years, overtake South Africa in terms of sheer size of economy. Of course, it's a country of, will be 200 million people soon compared to 50 million in South Africa. So per capita, it's nowhere near it. But long story short, a lot of countries did resent in 1994 when South Africa re-entered the system and was viewed by the rest of the world as kind of the leader on the continent. And you'll hear this time and again, they're not African. No, they're doing their own thing. This is not really a country that kind of fits in with the African paradigm. So there's a little bit of resentment out there. Recently, the South African candidate just won election as head of the AU, the former foreign minister, Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma. And especially by the Francophone countries, there was a lot. It was a very contentious election, so it wasn't very easy. South African businesses don't have the best reputation on the continent. And then xenophobia, which we'll talk about more, Professor Picard talked about last night. I've seen this up close. It's very ugly in certain situations. Getting back to the South Africans not viewing themselves as Africans. So they see guys from Zimbabwe or Somalia or wherever else as these, again, kind of Africans coming in, trying to take their jobs, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a problem. And then South Africans at home too. Do we want to be spending our time here? Is this a priority for us, especially in the case of all the domestic challenges they face? So let's conclude here. South Africa is considered an anchor state. We've used this term quite a bit, especially in the Clinton administration. This came up. Nigeria and South Africa are anchor states. We never clearly defined what that means. But it's in kind of an uncertain position. There's questions at home whether this is something they want to do. Peacekeeping, they've even started a development organization. the South African version of USAID in a sense, which for a medium middle income country is kind of surprising. And business is going to probably drive the ship, but also there's some questions over the current government's priorities. I mean, is Africa a priority for Jacob Zuma's government? We haven't seen it being the priority to the same extent it was under Mbeki. That's all. I'm sorry, I really kind of rolled through that, but I know we've got to do our prompts. And if we have time for questions before the next presentation, I'm happy to take them. So I think the prompts are coming around. Oh, please, yeah. If you Well, HIV is an indiscriminate disease. I mean, what we've seen, for example, there's a really shocking study just came out the other day looking at, I can't remember the figures, but essentially, for example, in South Africa and Southern Africa, you see what they call a sugar daddy culture, where men, for example, who have a little bit of money have a pretty easy time of having multiple sex partners who are younger women. And so HIV has wiped out a generation of really kind of the best and brightest in Southern Africa, not necessarily the poorest of the population, but men and women who are actually higher up the socioeconomic scale. So it's not a disease that really affects populations necessarily by socioeconomic status.
My question's about the leaders who are rising to power in South Africa. So the current government leadership, is it more of a military background, or is it, or do the leaders have some sort of like higher education or something like that?
It's a mix. Thabo Mbeki's government had a very impressive mix, a very highly educated cabinet. This government, Jacob Zuma, it's interesting. I mean, Zuma is literate, but he is beyond a 6th grade education. Learned to read in prison. A very different background than somebody like Mbeki. And so there is, we can talk about more this afternoon, but there's a kind of a question in South Africa over whether the political sphere has become kind of de-intellectualized. I mean, the ANC has a very proud intellectual tradition. However, there's questions over whether that tradition is being continued. And you saw Julius Malema yesterday, who, well, there's...
For the ones that are getting educated, where are they getting educated?
Oh, South Africa has an excellent university system. I think there's a global 500 list. I can't remember who publishes it, but the 500 best universities in the world, and 4 South African universities are on the list. And so if you you go to a South African university, UCT or Wits in Johannesburg, I mean, these are Western quality. And the issue is access to education. I mean, it's very similar in this country as well. I mean, there are excellent schools out there, but not everybody has the opportunity to go to them. If you can get into that top strata, the top 10% of South African graduates can compete everywhere. The bottom 90% are the problematic ones.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it is my understanding how you mentioned in one of your slides. You said that South Africa is not following the same major development trends as other African countries. So what are those trends you are referring to?
Oh, so in terms of South Africa following, oh yeah. Oh yeah, no, of course. The question of whether, how South Africa is following kind of the dominant trends on the continent. And what I was referring to is essentially this export-driven, primary commodity-driven growth. And so most of what you're seeing, the fastest growing economies are your oil exporters, minerals exporters. And South Africa just, certainly that is a piece of its economy, but it's not something that is showing 6%, 7% growth. So it's just saying that it's just because it's so well developed and so well integrated into the economy, it's not really kind of the same sort of a thing.
So you're taking those percentages that you gave us earlier for economic growth in Africa and comparing them to already developed nations.
Right.
How problematic is it to compare the two? Because it's a lot easier for a non-developed country to grow percentage-wise.
That's precisely the point. And this is where, and again, Afro-optimist, I don't want to be picking on any groups of people, which again, there's plenty of positive developments going on in the continent. But one big takeaway I'd throw out is, you just made that point very clearly. When your GDP, when your per capita GDP is $100 and you gain, $10, that's 10% growth. But you're still making $110 a year. And so this is what you look at these growth numbers, and everybody's really, economists love to talk about growth. I mean, it's how economists think. And so the growth numbers are a little bit misleading in that sense. I mean, they're there and they're impressive, but when you consider that you've got to grow like that for 50 years just to get to kind of middle income status.
Over the years, we've always heard about the exploitation of the African colonies by European nations.
Right.
Were any of these colonies ever begun with any benevolent intent?
Not really. You saw Sierra Leone and Liberia, which were kind of outliers in that they were settled by freed slaves from the United States and also from the UK. So as kind of a place to resettle, and not real well, but even Liberia essentially turned into a U.S. rubber colony by even by the 1940s. I mean, it was one of our biggest producers of rubber during World War II. And so, no, but for the most part, no. I mean, Africa was divided up at the 1885 Berlin Conference simply to provide territory. I mean, this was competition between France and all the European powers over who would have what. The 1870s, 1880s were a time of expansionism. It was still, as Professor Picard mentioned last night, this Cape to Cairo, a kind of small island country will have 25% of the population under its control. And so that was the goal. I mean, it was very little benevolence involved.
So you're saying it was always about money?
It's kind of always been about money, yeah. I mean, I think that's, I'm trying to think of a different explanation for it, but that's why I say I'm getting more and more interested in economics, because if you just follow the money, you can learn so much, sadly.
What kind of, political relationships do the countries within sub-Saharan Africa have with each other? As well as what kind of influence do the other countries above, like Egypt and Libya and all that, have on the countries in sub-Saharan?
It's a mix. So you've got generally, you can break down sub-Saharan Africa into ECOWAS, which is the Economic Community of West African States, SADC, Southern African Development Community. You've got your East African Community. So there's kind of subsets, about 4 or 5 different regions. Although increasingly you're seeing these regional organizations like COMESA, which is one that actually stretches from Zimbabwe all the way up to Egypt now. And so they're trying to, for example, if you're going to have a trade pact, if you're going to have a free trade area in SADC, then you're going to have one in COMESA, and you're members of both. Well, which rules do you follow? I mean, it's a very technical issue, but something that's becoming more problematic. It's a mix of competition and cohesiveness, depending on the issue. Southern Africa looks to South Africa somewhat resentfully, but South Africa is still the driver of the economy. Angola is an interesting country to look at. Angola and South Africa have had tetchy relationships, ever since '94. Nigeria and South Africa also, there's a competition for leadership. East Africa is fascinating. You've got Kenya, but you've got a bunch of states that are all relatively, East Africa is interesting because there's no one dominant state. And so there's constant back and forth, Ethiopia, Kenya, Sudan, Uganda, all kind of jockeying for leadership roles, sometimes working together, sometimes not. The broader answer is it depends, and it's just you've almost got to look at almost 2 countries to, every relationship's going to be a little bit different.
How is this country susceptible to the religious extremism in the next 5 to 10 years, and the problem it has, the refugee problem coming from the neighboring countries?
South Africa particularly? It is always possible to find extremists in any society, right? South Africa has a Muslim community, 5% of the population, generally very well integrated into the rest of society. It's not a place that I've ever really come across. I've been to many iftar dinners, and it's a very moderate Muslim community. That said, there are, you'll always find your guys who might be going to fight in Afghanistan or become energized by extremist issues. In general, though, it's not a huge issue in South Africa. And the second part was about the refugee.
The refugee problem it has with these neighboring countries from, like Botswana.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, Zimbabwe. It was talked about yesterday. I mean, Nobody knows the number. Somebody who I thought would tell me an elevated number once told me it was only about 500,000, for example, Zimbabweans coming down. Others have said 4 million. I mean, another statistical quandary that we're stuck with. A lot of people going back and forth, I mean, in terms of migrant labor.
I mean, is it going to affect this growing economy?
Probably not a whole lot. It's funny, there is a great study a few years ago looking at the problem of Zimbabweans and saying, okay, what is the economic impact of Zimbabwean immigrants? And they said, you know, at the end of the day, it's probably a net gain. Because one thing to remember too, a lot of these immigrants, and people forget about this, the brain drain of Africa, which is another issue I didn't even raise, but the issue of Africans leaving and going elsewhere in the world, you know, African American populations are the highest educated group of immigrants in the U.S. Most of them have professional degrees, but a lot of these guys are going to South Africa too. So I would meet Zimbabwe. I mean, I would meet car guards. I was like, oh, what do you? It's like, oh, I'm a Zimbabwean accountant. I'm just, you know, I'm biding my time until I can get some kind of work in a specialized field. Zimbabweans in particular are very, very well educated compared to South Africans. And so, but you know, Ghanaians, Nigerians, Somalis, these guys are often businesses. They're often net boons to the economy rather than being detractors of them. Although South Africans can be a little bit touchy about that and view them as competition. So, please.
Yeah, there was a question a couple questions ago about the impact of colonial powers on how these countries are developing now.
Right.
How does Ethiopia, which is kind of a piece of the pie that we've never taken up, kind of thing with that?
Yeah, no, Ethiopia has its own very complex history. I mean, it was invaded by the Italians finally, but you know, really was never really and truly colonized. But Ethiopia is an interesting place. You know, I'm not an Ethiopia expert, but I've worked on it a little bit, and Ethiopia does kind of stand apart from its neighbors. I mean, its development was, I mean, it's a very poor country. It's a very economically disadvantaged country, at least in terms of food security, for example. So it's dealing with a set of issues that are somewhat similar to other places on the continent. But in general, Ethiopia has kind of hoed its own road in that sense. And so it doesn't have the same linkages to the UK or to France or a colonial power that others have had. And so, yeah, it's a very difficult question to answer, but they haven't had that same sort of linkage with a colonial power.
I hate to interrupt, only just because of time. Since I saw a lot of you writing, why don't we take just 5 minutes to exchange with a partner, and then we'll go for a break. And we're very fortunate that John's with us the entire day, and he's our last speaker this evening too. So we'll have more time for Q&A, I promise, okay? So.
And grab me throughout the day if anyone wants to chat about anything. I'll be here.
Okay, thanks. Okay. So